My best friend Ted was such a really weird kid. I mean, I was too when I was really young. That's how the two of us became best friends, really. We were both sort of nerdy, bookish types, and all the other kids thought we were weird. As strange as I was thought to be, though, Ted was a lot stranger than even I was. He had this fascination with really weird stuff that even sort of freaked me out. He liked a lot of death-related stuff, as well as abandoned buildings and all sorts of other things. We grew up in the same town all our lives, so we were together since we were really young. Therefore, we did almost everything together as well. We saw each other every single day, and so even though he was a bit weird, I don't think I trusted anyone as much as I trusted him. So one day when we were both 14, he came over and asked me if I wanted to go check out this abandoned building. I was only slightly hesitant. I knew it was going to happen because we always did what the other wanted to do, but I did want to know beforehand what building he wanted to go to and why he wanted to investigate this one in particular. It was some sort of old school building, closed down long before either of us was born. For many years after that, they sometimes held voting booths there, but it had been shut down and boarded up for many years before Ted suggested this adventure of ours. It was a very old building right on the outside of town, while the newer school building was built in town. I had never actually been inside this old building before. It had closed and boarded up long before we ever had the chance to go inside, like I mentioned, and mostly I was kind of nervous about doing so. Hell, I didn't like walking through someone's yard, much less entering a building shut off from the public, but he was excited about going into it. Ted was interested in all this exploring stuff and got into that whole urban building exploration thing. This was really the only place around town that fit that description. We got in through a broken door in the back of the building. The brush and everything back there was very overgrown, and there was a lot of litter around as well. I had to be extra careful to not get anything prickly caught on me and poke my skin as I tried to make my way through all this mess. It was really icky. Inside of the old school was obviously no better. There was tons of trash and old equipment strewn throughout the place. I almost didn't understand why people like to scope out these places, because they were always so dirty and bad. I do have to admit they can be creepy and somewhat spooky though. Ted, on the other hand, was clearly having the time of his life. He was talking about how cool everything was. He was thinking about the kinds of students who used to walk down these hallways all the time. Now it was just an empty, deserted, and dead place. He was so fascinated by that. Ted wanted to go search the basement of the building, which I really did not want to do. But as you might have figured out by now, this was his adventure this time, not mine. I decided to follow him down there. It was much darker than I'd expected, but he'd brought a flashlight along to make up for that. It didn't keep it from being really weird though, just being there, thinking about all the times people had walked these halls over and over again, only for it to be silent and empty now. Once we arrived in the basement though, we heard this loud thumping noise. If it had been going on before, we certainly hadn't heard it from upstairs, but this noise had been so loud we definitely would have. It seemed to be coming from the far room, on the left side of the hallway. Ted, being like he was, wanted to find out what was making this noise right away. I was already nervous and unhappy about this situation. I tried to convince him not to mess with it, but then we heard the thumping noise continuing. By this time, he was way too curious to leave without taking a peek. As we went down the dark hallway, we heard the noise continue. I got more and more nervous the closer we got to that room. Whatever was going on in there, I really did not want to know. If I wasn't sure Ted would relentlessly mock me about this later, I would have just taken off without him. However, I did the best I could to keep my distance behind him. He was the overzealous one here, so he should be taking the risk over me. When we got closer to the door, he peeked inside. I had never seen the look on his face anything like I saw that day. It changed so fast. He turned whiter than I had ever seen him, and a look of terror covered his face. He stood there for a moment, seemingly unable to look away from whatever was on the inside of that door. I still didn't want to look, and I made no motion to go anywhere closer than I already was. It only took a moment for Ted to decide he'd seen enough now. He turned to me and whispered, "Let's get out of here now!" We began running down the hallway. Ironically, he was trying to be quiet, but his footfalls were making tons of noise down the hallway tiles. I followed him. When we got to the door to the staircase, I heard something coming from behind us. I turned around and looked back in the direction of the thumping noise. What I saw was that someone had opened the door, and their huge hulking figure was stepping out of the room. That's all I saw though. I wanted to get out of there before whatever scared my braver friend saw me too. We ran back up to the first floor and got out of that building as quickly as we could. The only part that really sucks about this is that Ted absolutely refused to tell me what he'd saw. At first, I had assumed he did this because he was trying to scare me. You know, maybe there was nothing in the room to begin with. But I know I saw the door open, and I saw the guy too. Even though I didn't get a good look at them, I know someone was there. So there must have been something truly horrifying inside that room. Something enough to scare a friend of mine who is extremely brave. I wonder what those large thumping noises were in the bottom of that abandoned school building. That's all I really know about it, and probably all I ever will. I recall seeing the total transformation of a mall when I was younger. When I was a kid, and even into my mid-teens, the major mall, which has long since been torn down, was actually pretty active. It had the only movie theater in the whole area, and was an extremely popular hangout for teenagers. When I was 15 though, an outlet mall opened up that wasn't very far from this mall. This brought a rather quick decline to the major mall. For a while, the mall hung on, because it still had the only theater in the area, but a few Regal cinemas soon began opening up, and at that point, it was curtains. The only thing really left there was a Ticketmaster. It didn't take long before that went under as well. Eventually, the mall became nothing more than a shadow of what it had been before. I honestly don't know a lot about what it went through from its closing until its eventual demolition. I knew that one of the reasons it was eventually going to be demolished was the worry it would become a haven for gang activity. I don't really know if that happened or not though. All I can tell you that happened during this time period is what happened when I decided to check it out myself. It was a pretty stupid thing to do, honestly. Even though I had a job, I spent a little bit of time being homeless. I was sleeping in my car to save up some money to eventually get a place to live. It wasn't actually as bad as some people might think it was, however. I had blankets and pillows. It was very comfortable. The only thing that really bothered me was having something to do, and I really had to often search for that. This brings us to the mall. I had heard from someone at work that they were still trying to figure out what they wanted to do with the massive building. I got to thinking, it might be somewhat interesting to go and check it out on my day off from work. Well, technically my night off from work. There were some pretty busy roads in that area, and if I didn't want to get caught snooping around, I had to go at night. I made sure it was pretty late outside when I did finally go to check the place out. I parked in a motel parking lot close by and then walked the distance to the mall. Walking around such a large and empty space was really weird at first. You know, now that I think of it, I'd never actually been in a parking lot before where it was completely empty. At first, I was just walking around the building. I had no intention of breaking into it or anything like that. However, at one point, I noticed one of the doors looked like it had a broken latch on it. I decided to check and see if I could get it open. It opened much easier than I thought it would, and now I was not sure what I wanted to do next. I thought for a moment and decided to go inside and check it out. Now this was truly a surreal experience. It was such a big and bustling area back in the day, and now it was just deserted, empty of people and fixtures as well. All of the stores had those big metal grating doors pulled down. When I shined my flashlight into them, I could still see merchandise and fixtures inside and things like that. There, of course, was not any people inside though. I decided to try and go up one of the escalators. It was turned off, of course, so I used it as a normal staircase instead. It was actually pretty solid. There wasn't a whole lot different looking on the top floor than the second floor. Although they did have an old Auntie Anne's, which gave me a craving for a pretzel. I walked by a bookstore and was looking at the bookshelves inside. I was moving the flashlight around trying to get a better look. When I moved it toward the back of the store though, I was caught by surprise when the light fell upon a man standing in the back, already staring at me from the darkness. I jumped from being startled, but didn't move the light. This guy clearly was not a security guard or anything like that. He was dressed in plain clothes. After looking further for a moment, I realized he had a gun in his hand, which he was holding down at his side. It only took the slightest movement of his arm raising up for me to realize I needed to get out of there now. And I did so. I ran back the way I came and jumped down that escalator. When I got to the bottom, I looked up and saw the man standing at the top, now joined by someone else. He hadn't fired the gun at me or anything, thank God. I hoped he was just trying to scare me away from the area. I don't believe he actually followed me down the stairs. I hurried toward the door I had gained entry from and got out. I kept expecting something to happen behind me, so I kept checking, but nothing did. While I hurried across the parking lot, I kept looking back to see if anyone was following me. Keep in mind this was a big parking lot, so I got a lot of chances to glance backward. At one point, I noticed the two men had emerged from the building, but they weren't trying very hard to chase me across the parking lot. I got to my car and got out of that place. There was an apartment building I had been using the parking lot in, and I didn't feel safe until I got back there. I knew there was no way the men could have followed me, but I still felt on edge about the whole thing. I learned my lesson that day about going into places where I don't belong. If the man had been anyone different, he might truly have shot me. Perhaps I had stumbled upon something illegal going on, and if I did, I think the way he and his friend chased me out was their best way of trying to scare me into never coming back. I can say that it worked very well. I've done a lot of hiking and exploring in my time, and one of my favorite things to do when I'm out in the woods is to find something left over from back in the days. What I mean is that I often come across old farm-type equipment, perhaps an old well or an old mine, sometimes even really old buildings. I often wondered about these buildings more than anything else. You could find houses, sheds, and all kinds of structures like that in the strangest of places. When I was still living at home, I decided to go out on a hike once. That ended up being what was probably the scariest experience of my entire life. I think I was 16 years old at the time. My family lived in an area that had a lot of woods around it to explore. I had spent more time than I can even recall walking around the area, exploring and finding new things, so by the time I was 16, I thought I couldn't be surprised by anything. On this day, however, I was absolutely surprised by what I found. At first, I couldn't quite tell what I was looking at, but I noticed a lot of unusual growth in a particular spot. I thought I should make my way over to it and explore. It looked like there was some sort of opening in the side of the hill. Curious, I began beating back some of the overgrowth to get a better look. At first, I thought what I had found was a cave. Pretty neat, but not extremely unusual for the area I was in. The more I checked it out though, the more I realized I had in fact found an abandoned mine. I had never seen anything like this one before, and I was immediately intrigued. Honestly, no thoughts went through my head about the possible dangers of exploring this abandoned mine. I just knew immediately I had to check it out. I had to spend some time clearing the brush out of the way so I could fully get inside though. The only light I had on me was from my wristwatch, and that wasn't exactly going to do a whole lot of good. I needed the light outside coming in to see. I cautiously stepped into the mine after I'd cleared out the growth. I wish I could explain the smell. It was an interesting odor that I'd never encountered before. As you might expect, the area was very dark and very dank. The light from the entrance was enough to allow me to see where I was going, but not by very much. Although it was intriguing, there was not very much to see at first. There wasn't any old equipment or anything like that. If it hadn't been for the support beams that had been built in, I probably would have just thought this was a completely normal cave. Finally, something did catch my eye, however. There was something up ahead of me, lying on the ground. It was covered in dirt or clay, or whatever made up the soil of this mine. It was a clear indentation, so I moved for a better look. When I got close enough, there wasn't really enough good light coming from the entrance to make out what I was seeing. I would have to rely on the small light from my wristwatch to make it out. When I turned the light on it, I immediately recoiled. Although I had been to funerals before, and I'd seen dead bodies in caskets too, I had never truly seen a human skeleton that wasn't in a classroom or a doctor's office. This was the very first time. I looked over the skeleton with the light. It had obviously been there a really long time. Skeletal remains were all that was left of this body. Everything else had decomposed a long time ago, or, I shuddered, been eaten by scavengers. What was the scariest part though, is that I noticed in the head of this skeleton there was a sizable hole. I immediately thought this person must have been murdered, probably by being shot in the head and left in this mine. When I've told this story before, people have asked me why I didn't check inside the skull to see if there was a bullet. My answer is always, how do you feel about picking up the skull of an old body and checking inside for bullets? That's kinda crazy, right? I knew I wasn't in any immediate danger, but that didn't stop me from being scared. At that point, I just wanted to get out of that mine as quickly as I could. I also didn't want to fall and injure myself though, so I had to be as careful as possible making it out. The last thing that mine needed was another dead body just inside the entrance. It was eerie as hell though, walking through the mine to get out. I had this irrational fear that someone or something was inside, and whatever killed this poor guy was going to get me next. I decided to go home immediately. I told my dad about what I had seen and wondered what we should do. In the end, he decided we shouldn't do anything, which I at first found rather shocking. My dad explained to me that firstly, I was trespassing on someone else's property. I couldn't really argue against that. Furthermore, he told me the body had obviously been there a long time, and there was no need to call attention to it and ruffle the feathers of whoever owned the property. I couldn't get the thought out of my head though. It bothered me deeply, thinking someone may have been missing for years, and finding this body could bring the family closure. I eventually did call the police, and left an anonymous message about what I had found and where exactly I had found it. I was really worried for a while. I would always try and read the newspaper after that before my dad could get to it. I was afraid the body would have been found in the mine, and he would be upset with me for going against his advice. The story, however, never ended up in the newspaper, at least not that I ever saw. I went out again a few months later to go check the same area. I wanted to see if the skeleton had been removed. However, I could never find the entrance to that mine again. A few times after that, I had similar results as well. I never saw the opening, and to this day I have no idea who that skeleton in that old abandoned mine was. Back in the early to mid 2000s, I attended summer camp for a few years. One year, I made friends with a camper in my cabin named Matthew. He returned the following summer as well, but was in another cabin, and we also became friends with another camper named Patrick. Swimming was basically a pool party where the entire camp would gather before getting ready for dinner. During this time, we would have private conversations. Matthew would tell stories, and because they weren't necessarily appropriate for the camp, we'd try to find some privacy. It's often hard to do that though, especially when the counselors weren't big on us campers wandering off on our own. One day, the conversation shifted though, from the typical naughty teenager stuff to Matthew asking us to help him practically kidnap a girl from her cabin and get her to the river. The plan was something similar to burying someone in sand at the beach. Matthew said they were friends and had a fight over something. The girl refused to speak to him, and this was a prank to get some revenge. I was not exactly sure this was just a joke though. I was trying to decide what to do. Was this really a sick prank he actually planned on going through with, or was this a murder plot or something? I seem to recall him mentioning the sick things he planned to do to her once he got her buried in the river as well, but my memory of this time is somewhat fuzzy. As Matthew swam away, I quickly told Patrick this was a bad idea, and he backed out of the plan. I used the layout of the cabin as my excuse not to help him. The back door was locked and never used, and the counselors hung out at the front door, having conversations at the picnic table on the side of the cabin, so it would be impossible to sneak out anyway. I'm not sure how he ended up getting caught in the end, as I can't recall that either. I think Matthew said something weird to the girl and she avoided him even further. When we backed out from helping him, he threatened her directly, and she told on him to the counselors. Eventually, they got suspicious and confronted Matthew. He melted down and confirmed he was telling us all these things. He then asked them to say goodbye to me and Patrick. The counselors that day pulled us out from dinner. I remember him telling us he was not a pervert or a peeping Tom. He just made it all up. Then he started telling us about all these arguments at home. At breakfast the next day, I asked Patrick what the deal was about Matthew. His family apparently came and got him, driving from out of state to do so. I never saw Matthew again, as he wasn't allowed back after that. I continued hanging out with Patrick until we went home in the end. I'm not sure what to really think about Matthew. I hope he's healthy now with no sick, twisted fantasies. Was he just making up stories like any other kid and going way too far? Or was he really going to do all those terrible things to that girl? I'm not really sure. The moral of the story, though, is that it's one thing to tell ghost stories around the campfire or pull a funny prank on fellow campers, like dressing up as Jason Voorhees. But if someone sounds like they're going to go too far, use your better judgment. You never know what their real intentions might be.